The screams echoing through Whispering Pine Valley on that October morning in 1937 would haunt Sheriff Clayton Morse for the rest of his days. What he discovered at the end of that blood-soaked trail would challenge everything he thought he knew about the families living in Kentucky's remote hill country. This is the story of how an entire bloodline turned the ancient art of hospitality into something unspeakably twisted, and why their legacy still casts shadows over missing person cases across 3 states. Margaret Whitlow should have been home by tea time on October 15, 1937. The schoolteacher from Millfield had set out that crisp autumn morning with her hiking companion, Robert Chen, a visiting professor from Cincinnati who'd heard tales of the spectacular fall foliage that painted the Cumberland Ridge. They'd packed enough provisions for a day trip, left detailed route plans with Margaret's landlady, and promised to return before the evening frost settled on the valley floor. Instead, their abandoned Ford Model A was found 3 days later, driver's door hanging open like a broken wing, engine still warm to the touch. The discovery came when Milton Hayes, a local timber worker, spotted the vehicle's chrome bumper glinting through a stand of sugar maples near Deadman's Creek. The car sat perfectly upright on a narrow dirt road that most locals avoided, a winding track that snaked deeper into the hills than any sensible person cared to venture. Margaret's leather satchel lay scattered across the passenger seat, its contents suggesting a hasty departure: half-eaten sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a thermos still quarter full of coffee that had long since gone cold, and Robert's expensive Kodak camera with its lens cap missing. But it was what Milton found 30 feet from the car that made his hands shake as he cranked the handle on the county's only telephone line that reached this far into the wilderness. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth. 2 sets heading away from the road toward a barely visible trail that disappeared into a grove of ancient hemlocks. And something else, droplets of what looked suspiciously like blood marking the path like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale gone wrong. Sheriff Morse arrived with his deputy, Jim Blackwood, just as the afternoon shadows began to stretch long fingers across the valley. Both men had served in the Great War, had seen their share of violence and death, but nothing had prepared them for what they would uncover in the next 72 hours. The trail led upward, winding through terrain so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy overhead. Every few hundred yards, they found more signs of passage: a torn piece of Margaret's blue wool coat caught on a blackberry bush, Robert's wire-rimmed spectacles lying shattered against a limestone outcropping. As they climbed higher, the very air seemed to thicken with an oppressive weight that made conversation feel like blasphemy. Even the birds had fallen silent. 3 hours into their search, they caught their first glimpse of smoke rising from a hollow they'd never known existed. The thin gray column twisted skyward from what appeared to be a ramshackle collection of buildings nestled so deep in the hills that no government surveyor had ever marked them on any official map. From their vantage point on a rocky ledge, Sheriff Morse counted at least 4 structures: a main cabin built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to the color of old bone, 2 smaller outbuildings that might have served as storage sheds, and what looked like a root cellar carved directly into the hillside. But it was the garden that made both lawmen exchange uneasy glances. Rows of vegetables grew in unnaturally straight lines, their dark soil appearing almost black in the fading light. Even from a distance, they could see that something was wrong with the earth itself. It looked too rich, too fertile for this elevation and terrain. And scattered throughout the garden plot were objects that shouldn't have been there: pieces of fabric fluttering like prayer flags, metal buckles glinting dully, and what appeared to be weathered bones arranged in careful patterns around each planted row. The sound that drifted up from the hollow made Sheriff Morse's blood run cold. Someone was singing a woman's voice, carrying a melody he recognized from childhood church services, but with words that seemed somehow wrong, twisted into something that made his skin crawl with primitive fear. Deputy Blackwood gripped his service revolver tighter and whispered the question that would define everything that followed. "Sheriff, what kind of people choose to live this far from civilization?" As darkness began to creep across the hollow like spilled ink, they would soon discover that some questions are better left unanswered, and that the family waiting in that hidden valley had been expecting visitors for a very long time. Before we continue down this dark path together, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if this story has already gotten under your skin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more cases that will challenge everything you thought you knew about human nature. Sheriff Morse's boots found purchase on loose shale as he descended toward the hollow, each step sending small avalanches of stone that seemed to echo like gunshots in the unnatural stillness. What he saw in those first moments would reshape his understanding of how far human beings could drift from civilization and what they might become in the process. Every missing person case that would follow would force investigators to ask the same haunting question. How many other forgotten valleys harbored secrets that civilized society refused to acknowledge? The approach to the settlement required nearly an hour of careful navigation down a slope so steep that both men had to grab onto tree roots and saplings to keep from tumbling headfirst into the unknown. As they drew closer, details that had been invisible from above began to resolve with disturbing clarity. The main cabin wasn't just weathered, it was ancient, built with construction techniques that predated anything either man had seen in modern Kentucky. Hand-forged iron hinges hung heavy on a door made from planks so thick they could have come from trees that were saplings when Daniel Boone first crossed the Cumberland Gap. But it was the smell that hit them first. A sweet, cloying odor that seemed to seep from the very soil beneath their feet. Deputy Blackwood, who'd grown up on a pig farm and thought he'd encountered every variety of organic decay, found himself breathing through his mouth to avoid the worst of it. The scent carried undertones of wood smoke and herbs, as if someone had tried to mask something far more unpleasant with the aroma of a Sunday dinner. At exactly 4:47 p.m., according to Sheriff Morse's pocket watch, they reached the edge of the cleared area that surrounded the buildings. From this vantage point, the garden's true nature became impossible to ignore. What they had mistaken for decorative arrangements were, upon closer inspection, human artifacts scattered among the vegetables with deliberate care. A woman's hairpin marked one end of a row of turnips. A man's leather wallet, weathered beyond recognition, served as a scarecrow's base in a patch of winter squash. And the bones, dear God, the bones were everywhere. They weren't randomly scattered or carelessly discarded. Instead, they formed intricate patterns that suggested both purpose and ritual. Femurs marked the corners of planted sections. Ribs created curved borders around herb gardens. Skulls, bleached white by weather and time, topped fence posts like macabre sentinels watching over the harvest. "Jesus Christ," Deputy Blackwood whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of wind moving through the trees. "How long have these people been living up here?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Carved into the trunk of a massive oak tree that dominated the center of the clearing, they found a series of marks that at first appeared to be random scratches. But closer examination revealed a crude calendar system, with notches and symbols that seemed to track not just years, but decades. The earliest markings, worn almost smooth by weather, appeared to date back to the 1860s. 3 generations, maybe 4. That's how long this family had been living beyond the reach of law, civilization, or basic human decency. The singing had stopped. In fact, all sound had ceased entirely. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving them standing in a bubble of absolute silence that felt more threatening than any storm. Sheriff Morse found himself straining to hear something, anything, that might indicate they weren't alone in this cursed place. Then came the sound that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. A door creaking open. Not the sharp squeal of modern hinges in need of oil, but the deep, groaning protest of ancient wood and iron that had weathered decades of mountain winters. The sound seemed to come from the main cabin, though neither man could see movement from their position behind a stand of birch trees at the clearing's edge. What followed was worse than any scream or shout of alarm. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heading directly toward their hiding place, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where uninvited guests might choose to observe from the shadows. But there had been no sound of their approach, no broken twigs or disturbed leaves to betray their presence. How could anyone have known they were there? Deputy Blackwood's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon, fingers closing around the grip with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts in dangerous situations. But something about this place, this moment, made him hesitate. The footsteps weren't hurried or aggressive. They moved with the patient rhythm of someone who had all the time in the world and who knew that their visitors had nowhere to run. As the sound grew closer, Sheriff Morse caught his first glimpse of movement through the trees. A figure emerged from the cabin's shadows, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in this wilderness. But the details of what he saw made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Because the person walking toward them wasn't quite walking at all, they were gliding, as if their feet barely touched the ground, and their silhouette seemed wrong somehow, distorted in ways that human anatomy shouldn't allow. The question that would torment investigators for generations was already forming in Sheriff Morse's mind. What happens to people who live outside civilization for so long that they forget what it means to be human? The woman who emerged from the cabin shadows moved like smoke given human form, her bare feet making no sound on ground that should have crunched with fallen leaves. When she spoke, her voice carried the musical cadence of mountain folk, but underneath lay something that made Sheriff Morse's skin crawl with primal recognition of danger. This encounter would establish a pattern that authorities would struggle to understand for decades. How isolation could transform human beings into something that retained the appearance of civilization while harboring appetites that belonged to humanity's darkest past. She called out to them by name. Sheriff Clayton Morse and Deputy Jim Blackwood, welcome to our home. The words drifted across the clearing with impossible clarity, as if she stood directly beside them rather than 50 yards away through dense undergrowth. We've been expecting you since yesterday morning. Both lawmen froze. Neither had announced their arrival to anyone except Margaret's landlady, and even she hadn't known their specific route into the hills. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, and the telephone lines didn't reach this elevation. There was simply no way this woman could have known who they were, let alone anticipated their arrival. Deputy Blackwood's hand tightened on his revolver, but Sheriff Morse placed a restraining palm on his partner's wrist. Something about the woman's posture, hands clasped loosely behind her back, head tilted with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, suggested they weren't in immediate physical danger, at least not yet. When they stepped from behind the birch trees, Sheriff Morse got his first clear look at their host. She appeared to be somewhere between 30 and 50 years old, though her exact age was impossible to determine. Her hair, the color of autumn leaves shot through with premature silver, hung loose past her shoulders in a style that had gone out of fashion decades earlier. She wore a simple dress that might have been fashionable in her grandmother's time, sewn from fabric that had faded to an indeterminate brown that matched the soil beneath her feet. But it was her eyes that would haunt Sheriff Morse's memory long after this case closed. They were the pale green of shallow water over limestone, and they held an intelligence that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance with the calculating precision of a predator sizing up potential prey. "I'm Constance Hartwell," she said, offering a slight curtsy that belonged to another century. "My family has tended this land since 1862, when my great-grandfather Silas first brought us up from the valley towns." The formal introduction felt surreal given their surroundings. Behind Constance, the garden with its grisly decorations stretched in neat rows, while the sweet stench of decay continued to rise from the dark soil. Sheriff Morse found himself struggling to reconcile the woman's mannered speech with the evidence of horror that surrounded them. "Ma'am," he managed, touching the brim of his hat out of ingrained politeness, "we're investigating the disappearance of 2 people who went missing in these hills 3 days ago. A school teacher named Margaret Whitlow and a visiting professor, Robert Chen. We have reason to believe they may have passed through this area." Constance nodded slowly, as if confirming information she already possessed. "Oh yes, the lost ones. They arrived at our door on Tuesday evening, just as the sun was setting behind the ridge. Such a lovely couple. Though they seemed terribly confused about where they were, the timeline didn't match. According to Margaret's landlady, the pair had left Millfield on Monday morning for a day hike. If they'd reached this isolated settlement on Tuesday evening, where had they spent the intervening 24 hours? And why hadn't they returned to their car, which was only 3 hours' walk from this location? They were invited to share our evening meal," Constance continued, her voice taking on the warm tones of someone recounting a pleasant social gathering. "My family doesn't often receive visitors from the outside world. We were delighted to offer them our hospitality." Deputy Blackwood stepped forward, his professional instincts overriding his unease. "Where are they now, ma'am? We'd like to speak with them if possible." Something shifted in Constance's expression, a micro-expression so brief that Sheriff Morse almost missed it. For just a moment, her mask of genteel hospitality slipped, revealing something predatory and cold underneath. Then the pleasant smile returned, and she gestured toward the cabin with fluid grace. "Why, they're still here, of course, resting after their long journey. Please, won't you come inside? I'm sure my family would love to meet you. It's been so long since we've had the opportunity to properly entertain guests." As she spoke, other figures began to emerge from the various buildings scattered throughout the clearing. First came a man who shared Constance's pale eyes and angular features, his clothes equally anachronistic, his movements carrying the same unsettling fluidity. Then came others, what appeared to be 3 generations of the same bloodline, all watching the newcomers with expressions of barely contained hunger. The youngest was a girl who couldn't have been more than 12, but something about her smile made Sheriff Morse's hand drift instinctively toward his service weapon. She moved with the confident, predatory grace of someone far older, and when she looked at him, he felt like a deer being evaluated by a pack of wolves. "My son Thomas," Constance said, indicating the man who'd appeared first. "My mother Eulalie, my daughter Rebecca, and the youngest, little Sarah." Each family member nodded in turn, their collective gaze never leaving the 2 lawmen. Sheriff Morse realized with growing horror that he was looking at a family that had lived in isolation for so long that normal human social development had twisted into something unrecognizable. But the question that would define every interaction that followed was already forming in his mind. If Margaret and Robert were truly resting inside that cabin, why did the very air around this place reek of death? The interior of the Hartwell cabin reeked of charred meat, and something far worse, a metallic sweetness that Sheriff Morse recognized from battlefield trenches where men had lain too long in the sun. As his eyes adjusted to the dim lamplight, he understood that some invitations should never be accepted, no matter how graciously they're offered. This was the moment when a routine missing persons case would transform into something that would challenge every assumption about the limits of human depravity and force investigators to confront questions that civilized society preferred to leave unanswered. Constance led them across a threshold, worn smooth by generations of bare feet, into a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and what passed for a parlor in this remote homestead. The space felt larger than the cabin's exterior dimensions should have allowed, stretching back into shadows that seemed to swallow the weak yellow glow from a handful of oil lamps. Hand-hewn beams supported a ceiling blackened by decades of wood smoke, while the walls displayed an odd collection of what appeared to be family portraits dating back to the Civil War era. But it was the dining table that dominated the room and commanded Sheriff Morse's horrified attention. Set for 7. 2 place settings showed clear evidence of recent use. Plates still held remnants of what had been a substantial meal, while wine glasses bore the lipstick traces of a woman who dined here not long ago. A man's pocket watch lay beside one plate, its gold chain coiled like a sleeping serpent across the rough wooden surface. Sheriff Morse recognized that watch. He'd seen Robert Chen checking it obsessively during their brief meeting at the Millfield train station 3 days earlier. "Please, sit," Constance said, gesturing toward 2 empty chairs with the practiced grace of a hostess who'd entertained countless guests over the years. "Mother is preparing fresh coffee, and I believe we still have some of Tuesday's roast remaining." Tuesday's roast. The phrase hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, carrying implications that made Deputy Blackwood's face drain of color. Because whatever had been served for dinner on Tuesday evening, it hadn't been beef or pork or any other meat that belonged on a civilized table. Thomas Hartwell had positioned himself near the room's only door, his lanky frame blocking any easy escape route. Unlike his mother, he made no effort to disguise his predatory nature. His pale eyes tracked every movement the lawmen made, with the focused intensity of a cat watching mice in a grain barrel. When he smiled, Sheriff Morse caught a glimpse of teeth filed to sharp points, a modification that served no practical purpose except to tear flesh more efficiently. "We don't often receive official visitors," Thomas said, his voice carrying the same musical mountain cadence as his mother's, but with underlying harmonics that suggested barely controlled violence. "The last revenue agents who climbed up here were—" "Oh, when was that, Mother?" 1928? 29, Constance corrected absently, as if discussing the weather rather than the fate of federal law enforcement officers. Right after the autumn harvest. Such persistent young men, though they seemed to lose their enthusiasm for their work after spending a few days with us. The family's casual references to previous victims sent ice water through Sheriff Morse's veins. This wasn't the random violence of desperate people pushed beyond endurance. This was systematic predation, carried out over decades, perhaps generations, with the methodical efficiency of a well-practiced ritual. Eulalie Hartwell emerged from what appeared to be a kitchen area, carrying a coffee pot that had seen better decades. The family matriarch moved with the painful deliberation of advanced age, but her mind remained sharp as a skinning knife. When she looked at Sheriff Morse, he felt like a side of beef being evaluated by an experienced butcher. "You're wondering about your missing people," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to speaking uncomfortable truths. "The schoolteacher and her gentleman friend. They asked the same questions you're asking now." She poured coffee into chipped porcelain cups with the steady hand of someone who'd performed this domestic ritual thousands of times. The liquid that emerged was thick and dark, carrying an aroma that didn't quite match any coffee Sheriff Morse had ever encountered. "Where are they?" Deputy Blackwood demanded, his professional composure finally cracking under the weight of mounting horror. "If they're resting, we need to speak with them immediately." Little Sarah giggled, a sound like wind chimes made from human bones. "Oh, they're very quiet now, much quieter than when they first arrived. Teacher Margaret kept asking about roads and directions, even after we explained that there aren't any roads leading away from here." The child's words carried implications that made Sheriff Morse's hand drift instinctively toward his service weapon. But before he could process the full meaning of her statement, Constance placed a restraining hand on his wrist. Her fingers felt cold as Winter Creek water, and her grip possessed strength that belonged to someone who'd spent a lifetime engaged in hard physical labor. Now, she said in the gentle tone a mother might use to calm a frightened child. There's no need for unpleasantness. We're all civilized people here, aren't we? Besides, your friends have already become part of our family, in the most literal sense possible. The coffee cup in Sheriff Morse's hand began to rattle against its saucer as the full implications of their situation became clear. But the question that would define everything that followed was already forming in his mind. How do you arrest an entire family when you're outnumbered, outgunned, and sitting 50 miles from the nearest backup? The sound of Sheriff Morse's coffee cup shattering against the cabin floor seemed to echo through the mountains like a gunshot followed by a silence so complete that even breathing felt like an act of rebellion against the laws of nature. In that crystalline moment of horror, he finally understood that Margaret Whitlow and Robert Chen weren't missing. They had simply become ingredients in a family recipe that predated the founding of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. This revelation would force investigators to confront an uncomfortable truth: that some forms of evil aren't born from desperation or madness, but from traditions passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. Constance Hartwell's reaction to the broken china was telling. Instead of concern or annoyance, her face lit up with the genuine delight of someone witnessing unexpected entertainment. She clapped her hands together twice, a sound sharp as breaking bones, and little Sarah scurried to clean up the mess with movements that suggested this wasn't the first time visitors had reacted poorly to family revelations. "Oh, you're beginning to understand," Constance said, settling back into her chair with the satisfaction of a teacher whose slow student had finally grasped a difficult concept. Most people take much longer to accept the reality of their situation. The school teacher, for instance, kept insisting there had been some sort of misunderstanding right up until Tuesday evening's main course. Thomas moved closer to the table, his filed teeth catching the lamplight like ivory daggers. "She had such lovely hands," he mused, examining his own fingernails with the detached interest of someone recalling a pleasant memory. "Soft from a life spent with books rather than manual labor. Mother used them in a wonderful stew that lasted us nearly 3 days." The casual nature of these confessions was almost more horrifying than the acts themselves. This family didn't see their cannibalism as aberrant behavior requiring justification or excuse. To them, it was simply the natural order of things, a sustainable way of life that had served their bloodline for 3 generations in these isolated hills. Deputy Blackwood lurched to his feet, his service revolver appearing in his hand with practiced speed. But before he could level the weapon, Eulalie spoke from her position near the kitchen area. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, young man." Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. When Blackwood turned toward her, he discovered why. The elderly woman held a shotgun that looked older than the state of Kentucky itself, but the steel in her eyes suggested she knew exactly how to use it. "Great-grandfather Silas taught us that hospitality works both ways," Eulalie continued, her gnarled fingers steady on the weapon's stock. "We provide food and shelter to travelers, and they provide food and companionship to us. It's a fair exchange that sustained our family through 7 decades of mountain winters." Sheriff Morse's mind raced through tactical possibilities. The cabin had only one door, which Thomas still blocked with his lanky frame. The windows were too small to provide escape routes, and even if they managed to break free of the building, they were 50 miles from civilization, through terrain that the Hartwells knew better than their own heartbeats. But it was the family's casual confidence that truly terrified him. These people weren't nervous or excited about having cornered potential victims. They were simply following a routine they'd perfected over decades of practice. "How many?" Sheriff Morse asked, his professional instincts overriding his terror. "How many people have you killed?" "How many?" Constance tilted her head thoughtfully, as if considering a mathematical problem. "Killed is such an ugly word. We prefer to think of it as providing sustenance and purpose to lost souls who would otherwise perish in these mountains anyway. Most of the people who find their way to our door are already half dead from exposure, dehydration, or simple exhaustion. Rebecca Hartwell, who'd remained silent until now, finally spoke from her position near the room's far wall. Her voice carried the dreamy quality of someone recounting a cherished childhood memory. "I remember my first harvest season. I was only 7 years old, but Father let me help prepare the traveling salesman who'd gotten lost in the blizzard of 1898. Such a kind man, he'd been carrying peppermint sticks for children in the valley towns." The family's use of euphemisms, harvest, sustenance, preparation revealed a psychological framework that allowed them to rationalize acts that would have horrified their great-grandfather's generation. They'd created an entire mythology around their cannibalism, transforming murder into a sacred family tradition. "The record books are in the root cellar," Thomas added helpfully. "Mother keeps meticulous notes about each guest's arrival, their personal effects, and their contribution to our winter stores." Great-grandfather Silas started the practice during the war between the states, when deserters from both armies would stumble into our valley looking for places to hide. Sheriff Morse realized with growing horror that he was looking at a family that had turned cannibalism into a sustainable business model. They didn't hunt their victims, they simply waited for the mountains to deliver lost travelers directly to their door. The isolation that protected them from discovery also ensured a steady supply of prey. But the question that would define their next move was already forming in his mind. How do you escape from people who've spent 70 years perfecting the art of making visitors disappear without a trace? Deputy Blackwood's finger tightened on his revolver's trigger as little Sarah skipped toward the root cellar with the carefree enthusiasm of a child fetching her favorite storybook, unaware that she was about to reveal decades of methodical murder, documented with the precision of a family Bible. The leather-bound ledger she retrieved would contain names, dates, and personal details of victims stretching back to the administration of Ulysses S. Grant. This moment would expose the true scope of American law enforcement's failure to recognize that entire families could operate as efficient killing machines for generations without detection simply because they chose their hunting grounds wisely. The ledger Sarah placed on the dining table was bound in leather so old it had cracked into patterns that resembled dried riverbed mud. When Constance opened it with the reverent care of someone handling a sacred text, Sheriff Morse caught glimpses of pages filled with spidery handwriting in various hands, suggesting multiple generations of record keepers had contributed to this macabre family history. "Here," Constance said, her finger tracing entries with obvious pride. "October 12th, 1894. Jeremiah Walsh, patent medicine salesman from Louisville. Age, approximately 45. Carried $17 in silver and a case of liver tonic. Provided sustenance for 8 days." She looked up with the satisfaction of a housewife sharing a successful recipe. Great-grandfather Silas was very thorough in his documentation. Page after page revealed the same methodical approach to murder. Names, ages, occupations, personal effects, and most chilling of all, detailed notes about how long each victim's remains sustained the family. The Hartwells had approached cannibalism with the systematic efficiency of a well-run business, tracking their inventory with the same care that legitimate merchants applied to their ledgers. Thomas leaned over his mother's shoulder, pointing to entries with obvious fondness. "This was my first harvest," he said, indicating a entry dated September 21st, 1906. Mary Catherine Finnegan, Irish immigrant seeking passage to cousins in Louisville, age 19. Exceptionally tender preparation. His filed teeth gleamed in the lamplight. "I was only 12, but Father allowed me to help with the butchering process." The casual nature of these revelations was perhaps more terrifying than graphic descriptions of violence would have been. The Hartwells discussed human beings in the same terms other families might use to evaluate livestock, reducing complex lives to simple entries focused on nutritional value and storage duration. But it was the most recent entries that made Sheriff Morse's blood turn to ice water. Margaret Eleanor Whitlow, schoolteacher from Millfield. Constance read aloud. Age 27. Carried $14, one Kodak camera, various personal effects. Companion, Robert Chen, professor visiting from Cincinnati. Combined preparation provided exceptional quality protein for extended period. The entry was dated October 15th, 1937, 3 days ago. Deputy Blackwood's face had gone chalk white, but his grip on the revolver remained steady. "You killed them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You murdered 2 innocent people who came to you for help." Eulalie laughed, a sound like autumn leaves scraping across tombstones. "Innocent? Child, nobody finds their way to our valley by accident. The mountains themselves guide lost souls to our door, and we simply fulfill our purpose as their final destination." The family's mythology had grown elaborate over the decades, transforming random chance into divine providence. They genuinely believed they were performing a sacred function, helping lost travelers achieve their destiny while sustaining their own bloodline through the harsh mountain winters. Rebecca moved closer to the table, her eyes bright with anticipation. Father always said that visitors who arrived with weapons were the most challenging to process. Something about the adrenaline affecting the meat's tenderness. She studied Deputy Blackwood with the calculating gaze of a butcher evaluating a side of beef. "I wonder if that applies to law enforcement officers as well." The implication was clear. The Hartwells had dealt with armed authority figures before, and those encounters had simply provided additional entries in their ledger of victims. Sheriff Morse realized that their badges and weapons wouldn't protect them. They would simply make them more interesting prey. Thomas began moving toward the cabinet, where additional firearms were undoubtedly stored, his movements deliberate but unhurried. The family had all the time in the world. Even if the lawmen managed to kill 1 or 2 of them, the survivors could simply wait for winter to trap them in the valley, then hunt them down at their leisure. But it was little Sarah who posed the question that would define everything that followed. "Mother, should we prepare the guest's room in the root cellar now, or wait until after they've finished struggling?" Because the Hartwells had learned from 7 decades of experience that resistance was futile, and that every visitor to their isolated valley would eventually become another entry in their harvest records. The crash of splintering wood echoed through the cabin as Deputy Blackwood kicked over the dining table, sending the Hartwell family's ledger of horrors sliding across the floor in a cascade of yellowed pages that documented 70 years of methodical murder. In that moment of chaos, Sheriff Morse understood that their only chance of survival lay in embracing the same savage violence that had sustained this cannibal clan through 3 generations of mountain winters. This confrontation would determine whether justice could prevail against evil that had grown as natural and inevitable as the changing seasons, or whether 2 more names would simply be added to a ledger that already contained enough victims to populate a small-town cemetery. Sheriff Morse drew his service weapon in the same instant that Thomas lunged for the gun cabinet, his filed teeth bared in a snarl that belonged more to a wild animal than anything remotely human. The confines of the cabin transformed into a battlefield, where furniture became weapons and every shadow concealed potential death. Eulalie's ancient shotgun boomed like thunder, the blast tearing chunks of wood from the doorframe where Deputy Blackwood had been standing a heartbeat earlier. The old woman's aim might have been affected by age, but her willingness to kill remained as sharp as surgical steel. She broke open the weapon with practiced efficiency, ejecting spent shells that clattered to the floor like brass raindrops. "Sarah, fetch the rope from the shed," Constance called out with the calm authority of someone directing a church social rather than a life-or-death struggle. "Rebecca, help your brother secure the gentleman. Try not to damage the meat too badly. Fresh law enforcement officers should provide us with enough protein to last until spring." Sheriff Morse put 2 bullets center mass into Thomas Hartwell's chest, the impact spinning the cannibal backward into the gun cabinet with enough force to shatter its glass doors. But instead of dropping, Thomas simply looked down at the spreading crimson stains on his shirt with mild curiosity, as if noticing an interesting pattern in the fabric. "You know," Thomas said conversationally, "Father always claimed that fear made the meat taste better. Something about chemicals released during the final moments." He reached into the broken cabinet and emerged with a rifle that had probably seen service in the Spanish-American War. "I never believed him until I helped prepare my first revenue agent. The bullets should have killed him instantly. By every law of anatomy and physics, Thomas Hartwell should have been bleeding out on the cabin floor. Instead, he was loading cartridges into a weapon with the steady hands of someone completely unaffected by what should have been mortal wounds. Deputy Blackwood emptied his revolver into Rebecca as she circled toward the room's far corner, trying to flank their position. 5 shots at close range, each one finding its mark, each impact causing her to stagger but not fall. She laughed as bullets tore through her chest and abdomen, the sound carrying the genuine amusement of someone watching a particularly entertaining performance. "Grandfather Silas used to tell stories about the old country," Rebecca said, "blood streaming from wounds that should have been fatal. About families who made pacts with things that lived in the deep mountains, things that offered protection in exchange for regular feeding. The implication sent ice water through Sheriff Morse's veins. Whatever the Hartwells had become over their decades of isolation and cannibalism, they were no longer entirely human. Bullets might slow them down, but conventional weapons wouldn't be enough to stop them." Little Sarah returned from her errand, carrying coils of rope that looked suspiciously like they'd been fashioned from human hair, dozens of different colors braided together into cables strong enough to bind struggling victims. She moved with the predatory grace of someone far older than her apparent 12 years, and when she smiled, Sheriff Morse saw that her teeth had been filed to points just like her brother's. "The mountain protects its children," Eulalie said as she finished reloading her shotgun. "We've fed it well for 70 years, and it keeps us strong in return. Your bullets can't harm what the mountain has blessed." The cabin's oil lamps began to flicker and dim, as if some invisible presence was drawing energy from the very air. Shadows stretched and moved in ways that defied the laws of physics, reaching toward the lawmen with grasping fingers that seemed almost solid enough to touch. Sheriff Morse realized with growing horror that they weren't just fighting a family of cannibals. They were battling something that had transcended human limitations through decades of unholy communion with forces that predated civilization itself. But as Constance raised her hands in what appeared to be some sort of ritual gesture, Deputy Blackwood spotted something that would change everything. A can of lamp oil sitting near the shattered gun cabinet, its contents slowly spreading across the wooden floor in a dark puddle that reflected the flickering flames. The question that would determine their fate was already forming in his mind. Could fire destroy what bullets couldn't touch? And would they survive the inferno that would be required to cleanse this cursed place from the earth? Deputy Blackwood's boot connected with the lamp oil can at exactly 9:43 p.m., sending a dark wave of petroleum across the cabin floor that turned the ancient wooden planks into a potential funeral pyre for an entire bloodline that had fed on human flesh for 3 generations. As flames began to lick hungrily at the oil-soaked timber, he understood that some evils could only be purged through fire, the same element that had cooked countless victims in this cursed kitchen. This final confrontation would determine whether the mountains of Kentucky would continue to harbor a family of cannibals or whether their reign of terror would end in the same flames that had prepared so many innocent travelers for their dinner table. The lamp oil ignited with a whoosh that seemed to suck oxygen from the entire cabin, creating a wall of fire that separated the lawmen from their supernatural tormentors. But instead of screaming or fleeing, the Hartwell family watched the spreading flames with expressions of mild disappointment, as if witnessing the destruction of a cherished heirloom. "Oh, how tiresome," Constance sighed, brushing sparks from her antique dress with casual indifference. "We'll have to rebuild again. This is the 3rd cabin we've lost to visitors with more enthusiasm than sense." "The 3rd cabin," Sheriff Morse felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place with horrible clarity. The Hartwells hadn't just been living in isolation for 70 years. They'd been systematically relocating whenever discovery threatened their operations. How many hidden valleys throughout Appalachia concealed the remains of previous homesteads? How many other families had adopted similar survival strategies during America's westward expansion? Thomas laughed as flames began to consume the gun cabinet, the sound carrying genuine amusement rather than fear or pain. Father always said fire was the only thing that could truly cleanse the mountain's children. But he never mentioned how refreshing it feels to finally be released from this particular form. As Sheriff Morse watched in horror, the cannibal family began to change. Their human facades started to dissolve like wax figures exposed to intense heat, revealing something underneath that predated civilization itself. Constance's genteel features melted away to expose angles and planes that belonged to no earthly anatomy, while her children underwent similar transformations that suggested their humanity had been nothing more than an elaborate disguise. But the fire that was revealing their true nature was also destroying them. One by one, the Hartwells began to collapse as flames consumed the ancient timbers that had sheltered their unholy practices for decades. Their bodies crumbled like autumn leaves, leaving behind only shadows burned into the cabin walls, and the acrid stench of something that had never been entirely alive. Deputy Blackwood grabbed Sheriff Morse's arm, pulling him toward the door as the roof beams began to groan under the weight of spreading fire. "Move! This whole place is going up!" They burst from the cabin into the cool mountain air just as the structure's interior became a roaring furnace that sent sparks spiraling toward the star-filled sky. Behind them, the building that had housed 3 generations of cannibals collapsed in on itself with a sound like bones breaking, while the garden with its grisly decorations began to smolder as flying embers found new fuel among the dried remains. But it was what they found the next morning that would haunt both lawmen for the rest of their lives. In the smoking ruins of the root cellar, they discovered evidence of the Hartwells' true scope of operations. Not just the ledger they'd seen in the cabin, but dozens of similar records dating back to the 1850s, detailed maps showing other isolated settlements throughout the Cumberland Mountains, and correspondence with families bearing different names but sharing the same predatory appetites. The Hartwells hadn't been an isolated aberration. They'd been part of a network. Sheriff Morse spent the remaining weeks of autumn contacting law enforcement agencies throughout Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, sharing information about missing persons cases that might be connected to remote mountain families. The responses he received suggested a pattern of disappearances stretching back to the Civil War era, concentrated in areas where isolation provided perfect cover for systematic predation. By the time winter arrived, 7 other families had been located and dealt with through various means. Some were arrested and tried in courts that struggled to process crimes that challenged basic assumptions about human nature. Others simply vanished, their homesteads found empty except for evidence of hasty departures. But the files that Sheriff Morse compiled during those investigations raised questions that authorities preferred not to answer publicly. How many other predatory families remained hidden in America's remote regions? What happened to bloodlines that spent generations living beyond the reach of civilization and law? The official report on the Ashley incident, as it came to be known in law enforcement circles, was classified and buried in federal archives, where it would remain hidden for decades. The missing persons cases attributed to the Hartwell family were quietly closed. Their victims remembered as unfortunate travelers who'd simply gotten lost in dangerous terrain. Margaret Whitlow and Robert Chen were posthumously honored at a memorial service in Millfield, where their deaths were attributed to a hiking accident that claimed both their lives. Their families never learned the true circumstances of their disappearance, and the school children Margaret had taught were told she'd moved to a teaching position in another state. But sometimes, even now, hikers in the Cumberland Mountains report finding abandoned settlements that shouldn't exist on any official map. Places where the soil is too rich and too dark, where human artifacts lie scattered among overgrown gardens, and where the very air carries a sweetness that makes experienced outdoorsmen turn back rather than investigate further. Because some appetites, once awakened, prove remarkably difficult to eliminate entirely. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.